Alright, so Chapter 4, Video 1. Again, quick materials check. If you don't have your PowerPoint and your worksheet, go ahead and hit pause and pick that stuff up. Be ready for it. What we're talking about in Chapter 4 is just some of the circumstances that will kind of start gearing us toward the revolution. And one thing that needs to be understood is an idea called mercantilism. Countries' strength was, various countries' strength was determined by the amount of gold or silver that they had, their wealth. But there came to be a realization that the amount of gold and silver in the world was limited. And so they were going to need to get wealth in different ways. And Great Britain is going to start viewing the colonies in terms of how we can make them money and add to their strength and wealth. They're going to pass a series of laws called the Navigation Acts. And there were several of them, but what the sum of them was that the colonists could buy goods only from the British, only off of British ships, only out of British ports. We were not supposed to be trading with France, for example, or Spain, or any other country, because Britain wants to get all of our money and not have to share with anybody else. Now, the enforcement of these laws was brief at first. They were kind of put on the books. Britain's going to be occupied with a number of other things for a while and not enforce these laws very well, which is only going to mean later on when they try to enforce them, we're going to resist it. There also was an event in England called the Glorious Revolution. We don't spend a lot of time talking about history in England because that's not really the focus of this course. But the Glorious Revolution is going to impact us. What ends up happening with the Glorious Revolution is that there will be limits placed on the king's authority. There also will be religious tolerance for all Christians in England. But it sets a precedent for rebelling against a monarch, and we're going to see that over here in the colonies. We're going to be aware of this. Now, they kept a king, but there were limits on the king's power after the Glorious Revolution. John Locke is writing during this time, and he wrote something called Two Treatises of Government, on Government. And he talks about that we have entered into a social contract with government, that the government is supposed to protect our life, our liberty, and our property, he said. And as long as they were doing that, we would obey the government. But as soon as the government stopped protecting those rights that we have by nature, then it was up to us to choose another government. And Locke's work, Two Treatises on Government, will be read by a lot of our founding fathers, our early leaders, and it will make a big impact on their impression of how we should go about dealing with the king when we start having trouble with them. We also see in 1676 some conflict going on in what's called Bacon's Rebellion. Nathaniel Bacon had been an indentured servant. He had served out his time, and he had been given land in the western part of Virginia. The western part of Virginia was subject to a lot of Indian attacks, and they kept appealing to the government in the eastern part of Virginia, Governor Berkeley in particular, to send help, to send military, to send money, to send supplies. And it seemed that Governor Berkeley and the government in the eastern part of Virginia was turning a deaf ear to them, wouldn't send any of the help that was being requested. So after one skirmish, particularly bad skirmish between these folks in the western part of Virginia and the Indians, they ended up just kind of moving to the east to go after Governor Berkeley. And you can read more about it in your textbook, but what ultimately ends up happening is that Bacon is going to seize power for a brief period of time, and then he dies. And Governor Berkeley is going to come back and punish the people who were involved in this rebellion very strictly, very harshly. But what we see in Bacon's Rebellion is a growing conflict between folks who had been here, the colonists who had been here for a while and who considered this their home, and the British government who considered this a job. They'd come over and serve out their job, their period of time, and then go home to England. We need to take a quick minute and talk about the Spanish too, and why there aren't a lot of Spanish colonies, or we don't see Spanish colonies in North America like we see English colonies in North America. And part of that is that the Spanish seem to be coming here for different reasons. They were coming to find riches. They were coming to convert Native Americans to Catholicism. They weren't necessarily coming to settle and build a new life. So in the southwestern part of North America, they didn't find gold or silver. They were having to fight the Indians a great deal. They're worried more about military conquests and religious conquests than about establishing a colony where people could come and live a new life for themselves. And so it really will not develop as Spanish colonies like we see the English colonies develop on the East Coast. And then we need to start talking about the French as well. We had talked about explorers making a claim on Canada and coming down the Mississippi River to New Orleans, which gave them claim to all that territory as well. The French are going to get along a lot better with the Native Americans than the English did, than any of us did. And this is for a number of reasons. One reason is where the French were settling, there wasn't a lot of good farming, or they at least didn't engage in it. Certainly in the areas in Canada, there wasn't a good amount of farming being done, and as they came down the Mississippi River, they did more trapping and trading. So they weren't taking land from the Native Americans, and in fact, when they were doing their trapping and trading, they're trading with the Native Americans. So they're building business relationships. They also build personal relationships. There's some intermarriage that happens there. They learn to speak the Native American languages and so forth, and really integrate well. And they also seem to take every opportunity to make the Native Americans dislike the British, to kind of keep that pot stirred up. And we're going to see that happen as a result, perhaps, or it will lead perhaps to a number of wars between Britain and France. And the majority of these wars had begun in Europe and then carried over to be fought in the northern parts of the British colonies. The exception to that is the last war, which they call the 7 Years' War, and we call the French and Indian War, meaning the French and the Indians were fighting against the British and the colonists. As a result of all of these wars, something around 900 men from Boston died over all these years and all these wars. And so what we see here is after the French and Indian War, when the British government is broke as a result of all these wars and in considerable debt, when they start coming down on the colonists about doing their part, the men in Boston, the remaining men in Boston, the widows, the orphans in Boston, certainly feel like they have done their part. And they don't like the British saying that it's time for them to start paying their fair share.